Chapter 10 is when we learn major skeletal muscles of the muscular system. Um, we're not going to learn them all. There's anywhere between 600 or 700 muscles in a typical human body. That number varies because there's slight differences in humans. There's also different ways to think of a muscle as far as how many there are. Some muscles are kind of compartmentalized and have different parts. So do you consider those different muscles or all the same muscle? But that's a lot of muscles, up to 700 or more in the body. We're going to learn the major ones, which is going to be plenty for us. You're not going to learn them in a couple days. You have to learn them over a long period of time. So that means the sooner you get started, the easier it's going to be. So you try to learn maybe, 5 to 10 muscles a day. You don't try to learn 60 muscles 3 days before the exam. So we want to get started on this as soon as possible. I'm going to first teach you how to think of muscles, how to learn muscles, and that's largely based on how they're named. The name of the muscle is going to give you a lot of information. So we want to make sure we know the reasoning behind the name. We're going to learn some features and some terminology like origin and insertion. Those are basically the two ends of the muscles. One end is going to move, that's the insertion. The other end is non-moving end. We're going to learn what an agonist is. That's basically the muscle performing the action that we're talking about. A muscle that's doing the opposite of the action is an antagonist. So agonist and antagonist do opposite things. Prime movers are the muscle that provides the most force for a given movement. So those are always going to be the most important muscles. And then a synergist is a muscle that does the same thing as the agonist. So if the agonist flexes the elbow, so does the synergist. But if the agonist flexes, the antagonist extends. All right, but we'll talk more about that. And then these are the categories. These are the categories I recommend you group muscles into. So basically you work on all the muscles of facial expression until you know them really well. Then you move on to the next group and then the next group. All right. Okay, so this slide is going to teach you how to learn muscles. So if you follow these steps, you don't need me, right? You don't need me explaining every muscle to you. So if you have a method to learn a muscle, it'll stick, all right? And the method is a step-by-step process. So we have a list of muscles. It's your study guide. So study guide 10 is basically the list of all the muscles that are going to be fair game and what those muscles do. Typically in a muscular system exam, you're going to need to be able to identify the muscle. You're going to need to know what the muscle does. You might have to know what group that muscle belongs to and a few other characteristics. But this is the procedure I recommend you use. So step one, why did they name it that way? All right, what characteristic of that muscle was used to name it? Sometimes it's a body region. Sometimes it's the shape of the muscle or the size of the muscle. Sometimes it's the direction the muscle fibers are running. Sometimes it's action. So what does it do? Is it a flexor? Is it a adductor? Origins. Some muscles have more than one origin, so we call it a bicep. Some muscles have, or two origins would be a bicep. If it has three origins, it's a tricep. Sometimes we name it after the origin and the insertion. That's basically the two ends of the muscle. Step two, you put it in a group. And that's what your study guide already does for you. It lists all the muscles, but it puts them in groups. The groups that we learn are facial expression, mastication, which are muscles that move your mandible when you chew your food. Respiratory muscles allow you to breathe. Abdominal muscles are obviously in your abdomen. Scapular muscles move the scapula, so on and so forth. So learn a group, all right? They're all going to be similar because they all do a similar thing. So you learn those all together, and then you move on to the next group. Number 3, pretty simple. Can I identify it on a picture? Obviously, your lab activity is going to supply all the pictures that are going to be fair game. You've got ID games in Canvas, but practice labeling, practice identifying. Step 3, what does it do? So obviously, identifying is in the anatomy portion. What does it do, or the action is the physiology. So does it flex the elbow? Does it abduct the shoulder joint? Does it raise or elevate the scapula? Does it flex the knee? So those are all actions. Number 5, is it a prime mover? So if you see anywhere in the PowerPoint that it suggests that that muscle is the prime mover, those all go to the top of the list because they provide the most force for whatever action it is. And these are the major prime movers, by the way. So if you were to start and just say, you know what, I'm not going to go group to group, I'm going to go, what are the most important muscles? These would be definitely the most important muscles to know, all right, on this list. 5, are there any synergists? So is there another muscle that does the same thing? So obviously if 2 muscles do the same thing, you want to kind of learn them together. Are there any muscles that do the opposite action? So are there any antagonists? So like the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii are antagonists. One of them flexes the elbow, that's your biceps. One of them extends the elbow, that's your triceps. So you want to put those 2 in the same place in your brain so you understand that they're related because they do opposite things. And then finally, some muscles, not all, you're going to need to know the origin and the insertion. I'll talk more about what that means, but the insertion is always the most important because remember, the insertion is the end that moves. So if it inserts into the humerus, then it must move the humerus. So the insertion is always pretty important. All right. So that's the process I recommend. You can try to do it your own way, but this is just the step-by-step process I recommend you use. These are all characteristics used to name muscles. I'm not going to go over all this. You can kind of pause me if you want and go through these. But when you get to a muscle and you look at its name and you don't know one of the words in the name of the muscle, look it up. All right, it's going to help you. So some muscles are named based on the orientation of the muscle fibers or fascicles. So if they run parallel to the midline, usually a midline is vertical, right? So like if it's the midline of the human body and it's in your abdomen and this muscle runs parallel, it's called a rectus abdominis. So rectus means parallel to the midline. If you're perpendicular, so now instead of running vertically, you run horizontally, we use transverse. So the transversus abdominis runs horizontally or transversely in the abdomen. And then if you run on an angle or diagonal to a midline, we use the word oblique. So your abdomen has a rectus, a transversus, and 2 obliques, an external and an internal. Then these are all size words. These are all shapes. On the next slide, we could use actions. So flexor, extensor, abductor, adductor, all right, levator, depressor, all right, those are all action names. So for example, if you get to a muscle called the flexor carpi radialis, you ask yourself, what does flexing mean? Okay, it decreases in angle. What does carpi mean? That means that your wrist, so it must flex the wrist, and it runs along the radius side, all right, of your forearm. If it extends the wrist, we're going to use extensor carpi, and if it runs along the ulna side, we use ulnaris. All right, so look at the name. It tells you a lot about the muscle. Number of origins, bicep, triceps, quadriceps. Location, temporalis is near the temporal bone. Frontalis is near the frontal bone. So we could just use kind of a region or location. And then this last characteristic is we'll take the origin or the non-moving end and the insertion, the moving end, and name it after that. So sternocleidomastoid comes from the fact that it originates from the sternum and clavicle. So it doesn't move your sternum and clavicle. It attaches to your mastoid process and moves that. And if you move the mastoid process, you'll move your head. All right? So these are characteristics. And, I always say to students, when they named the muscles, they did a pretty good job. They didn't randomly, use words that didn't make any sense. They actually sat down, thought about each muscle, and decided on a pretty good name. The problem always is with muscles is there's a lot of them. But kind of like bones, learning a single muscle isn't the hard part. It's getting through the list. All right, and it always depends on how much time you put into it. All right, so before we get into actual muscles, this slide is going to teach us about some terminology. So the first thing we want to do is look at this arm. All right, this is the brachium. All right, your brachium is shoulder to elbow. There's some muscles in there. We see this one here is your biceps brachii muscle. This one back here is your triceps brachii muscle. So bicep has two origins. These are the two origins. So an origin is the non-moving attachment. So it's got two tendons here. Notice one of them attaches to the coracoid process. One of them attaches just above the glenoid. So they both originate off the scapula. And the biceps does not move your scapula. So those are the origins. All right. These two tendons, this actually is called the long head tendon. Heads are the belly of the muscle, is often called a head. But that is the long head tendon. That's the short head tendon. Here's the muscle portion, or the belly. And then here is the insertion tendon. So it inserts, if you remember, on the radius, specifically at the radial tuberosity. So it's got two origins, one insertion. So how do muscles work? Notice here, this is just a schematic to think about. The origin doesn't move, so it's stable. In this situation, that muscle is long, it's relaxed. So when the muscle contracts, it pulls the insertion towards the origin. All right, so notice the green dot moved because the green dot represents the insertion. So it's going to pull the radius towards your scapula, and if you do that, you decrease the angle, therefore you flex. So the biceps brachii is an elbow flexor. All right. Now, once it relaxes, right, that insertion goes back, and therefore your elbow extends. But the muscle isn't doing that. The muscle is relaxing when you extend. So there's got to be another muscle that does the opposite. And that's back here. That's your triceps brachii. So it's a tricep because it has three origins. It has one insertion on your olecranon process of the ulna. So when it pulls on that olecranon, it's going to extend the elbow. All right? So know what an origin is, know what an insertion is. An agonist performs the action. So if the action is flexion, the agonist is the biceps. The opposite action is the antagonist. So if the action we're looking at is flexion, then the antagonist is the triceps. All right, it performs the opposite. Prime mover provides the most force. So a biceps brachii is the prime mover for elbow flexion. There's another one we're going to learn called the brachialis. Does the same thing. It just isn't as powerful. So the biceps is the prime mover, and the brachialis would be a synergist. It works with the bicep, does the same action, but it doesn't provide as much force. And the same is true with the triceps. Triceps is the prime mover for elbow extension, but there's another one we're going to learn that's a synergist. All right? So these are some terms we're going to be using. So when you hear me use these words, right, you should understand them, okay, and think about them. Learning a muscle, you really want to analyze it, all right? Think about it. Think about other muscles and the relationship between muscles. You don't want to just rip through and try to memorize. You want to really analyze. And analyzing a muscle takes a little more time, but you're going to remember it much easier if you really analyze the muscle. And remember, you have all these. So right now, you should be flexing and extending your elbow and feeling your biceps contract when it shortens, your triceps relaxed, and then you extend and you should feel your triceps contract and your biceps relax. If you're not using your muscles, that's just one more thing that's going to help you. Okay, so next video, we'll start a whole new video and dedicate it strictly to, starting off with facial expression and maybe moving on to mastication. So this first video is kind of an introduction to muscles, teaching you how to learn them, how to think about them. And then the next video will actually start down our list. You should have the study guide in front of you. I would have that. Again, that study guide is just a list, but it's a way to keep track maybe of what muscles you know pretty well and what muscles you need to work harder on.